Tonight on Talking Politics, with state receivership looming and a host of troubling developments within the Boston Public Schools making headlines seemingly by the day, state and local officials can agree on one thing: the big problems require big solutions. But there is less consensus when it comes to who should make those fixes and exactly what the fixes should be. We'll dig into all that ahead, but first, Massachusetts Democrats began meeting today to decide who they'll endorse for several statewide offices by the time their convention wraps up tomorrow. In the race for governor, current Attorney General Maura Healey is expected to nab the endorsement, and State Senator ChangDiaz has said for months that she'll clear the 15-point threshold needed to get her name on September's primary ballot. But several of the down-ticket races are a toss-up, and in the race for lieutenant governor, it's likely that at least one of the 5 hopefuls won't make it past the convention. Joining me to discuss all that and the state legislature's big to-do list before they wrap up for the summer are Boston Globe State House reporter Matt Stout and Steph Solis, former Boston Business Journal digital editor and now a reporter for the soon-to-launch Axios Boston. Good to see you both. Steph, let me start with you. I'm curious about what your expectations are for the governor's race in particular as we head toward Worcester. Is this going to be a coronation of sorts for Maura Healey, or might ChangDiaz surprise some people?
All signs seem to point to a Healey coronation, as you put it. The fundraising dollars are there. The delegates are there. Even some of the undecided delegates appear to be focusing on who they believe will win and who will provide steady leadership. And a lot of people say Maura Healey represents that. However, there is still a vocal faction of progressives who see that as someone who will fail to shake up the status quo. And I think that's the group that's coalescing behind ChangDiaz. I do expect that she will end up on the ballot. I just don't know how much of a dent she's really going to make. It
was interesting this week, I thought, to see some of the people whose, at least one prominent person, I'm thinking of State Rep Mike Connolly, whose worldview is very much in sync with ChangDiaz's, opt to endorse Healey heading into the convention. Then you had Karen Spilka endorse her, Deborah Goldberg, which I would think that ChangDiaz people weren't thrilled about. Matt, you just wrote a great profile of ChangDiaz that anyone who's interested enough in this stuff to watch this show should read if they haven't already. You've also been reporting on the run-up to the convention and what we can expect in the governor's race and elsewhere. What's your sense from talking with ChangDiaz and ChangDiaz supporters of whether they think she can still win this thing? Do they genuinely believe that she still has a shot at being the Democratic nominee?
I think there's a wide realization that this has always been an uphill battle, whether she announced when Charlie Baker was still perhaps running and obviously when Healey got in January. I think there's always this idea of you get to the convention where there's also this subset of Democrats or set of Democrats who just want a primary. Maybe they don't really believe ChangDiaz will ultimately win, but they want to have this sort of exchange of ideas that they want to at least have Healey be tested in a primary where maybe she, agrees to some more, progressive policies that people, people on the left really want. But she definitely, at least at that point, has this helping put her on the ballot and help her drive her there, which I think there's this idea of like, once you get past the convention, have a couple debates, Sonia gets her shot. Whether it is sort of an impossible shot, I think there's a lot of people that believe it's a foregone conclusion that Healey win. But I think there are still a lot in the Democratic Party who have these sort of can't fail candidates in the past who have lost, who at least want to have this discussion and want to have this primary to, at the very least, test Maura Healey before she, gets into the general.
Yeah, that's a good point. For a lot of people, it's not just about getting her to commit to progressive positions necessarily, but if they want a primary, they might just want to see that she's capable of weathering some direct challenges, right? In a debate format, for example. Is she up to this? Kick the tires a little bit. Steph, what other subplots are you going to be paying attention to at the convention in Worcester?
It will be refreshing to get a better sense of how the LG and AG races will be taking shape. It's always great to see a diversity of ideas, thoughts, backgrounds, but there are just so many candidates for lieutenant governor that I think people are ready to see who comes out in front, whether that's Eric Lesser with his fundraising totals, or maybe someone on the eastern side of the state like Kim Driscoll. The other thing is, I imagine there might be some tensions that come to the surface following the controversy over the ballot initiative. As you know, Mass Dems initially planned to allow the campaign behind the Uber Lyft ballot initiative to advertise, and it appears that has since changed. But I could see some awkwardness there.
That's the ballot initiative, tell me if I've got this right, that would essentially qualify Uber and Lyft drivers as independent contractors. It would codify that in state law so that the companies that they work for would maybe not be liable for some of the things they do in certain ways and not subject to certain requirements. Did I get that right, more or less? Okay.
Yeah.
Matt, Steph mentioned a couple subplots. Is there anything else that you are especially intrigued by as we head toward this convention?
You know, I say this with a big grain of salt. I mean, there is a Secretary of State's race where you have an incumbent in Bill Galvin who's being challenged by Tanisha Sullivan. And, you know, the convention is a good way to test, well, how are activists feeling about, you know, Sullivan as a challenger, and, where are they on Galvin after 7 terms? But I always think back to 2018 when Galvin faced a challenge from Josh Zakim. Zakim won the endorsement in an upset at the convention, and it meant almost nothing by the time it got to September because Galvin won away by 35 points. And I think he lost all but, 3 communities statewide. So it is sort of a test, and at least sort of a temperature taking, if you will, but also kind of keeping in mind, even if Tanisha Sullivan were to win the endorsement, which is sort of unclear how that's going to go, how much does that really mean come June 5th? I guess that remains to be seen, but it is sort of this first test of, well, how serious of a challenge does Galvin have here for an 8th term?
And Galvin, running for an 8th term, which is remarkable in and of itself. And he seems to have this ability to run again and again and win, even though you don't see him campaigning or advertising in the way that we're used to seeing other statewide candidates. He just kind of keeps on going because he's Bill Galvin, or that's how it seems to me. Let's turn to the State House for a little bit. Matt, Governor Baker has been pushing really hard for a variety of tax relief proposals over the past few months. The legislature, to my ear anyway, and I don't spend nearly as much time there as you do, but it seems like they've indicated an openness to tax relief, but also made a point of stressing that they'll do it at their own pace when they're good and ready, if they do it. What is your sense right now of whether some sort of meaningful tax relief for different Massachusetts residents might become a reality by the time the legislature wraps up at the end of July?
I think there's almost 2 questions wrapped in there. Is one, do they do something? And how meaningful is it? As we stand now, early June, in terms of the legislative calendar, that is not a lot of time to move through what could be a complicated and perhaps hotly debated tax relief bill from now until July 31st. I think back to, and it's to 2013, where we're kind of on the other side of the coin, where there was this big tax increase package that the governor, then Governor Val Patrick, released in January. By early April, the legislature, both the House and Senate, came out with sort of their counter proposal. And it wasn't until late July that thing almost got settled. I mean, doing sort of this separate tax bill outside of the budget, which is guaranteed to pass, it leaves a lot in the air. And it's really hard to tell what the legislature is willing to get behind, but also how far reaching will it be when you only have a couple weeks to really sort it out. And that is a really big question where it seems like they're interested in doing something, but like, how far does it stretch and how far does it impact someone, just the residents in the state and on a wide level? Really good question that I don't know if anyone can really answer right now.
Steph, I want to ask you about another development that's been getting a lot of attention. That's the push to let some unauthorized immigrants get driver's licenses. The House and Senate gave Governor Baker a bill that would do that. He recently vetoed the bill. We have an excerpt from the letter that he sent vetoing it. The governor said, "I cannot sign this legislation because it requires the Registry of Motor Vehicles to issue state credentials to people without the ability to verify their identity. Additionally, it restricts the registry's ability to share citizenship information with those entities responsible for ensuring that only citizens register for and vote in our elections." There are 2 different arguments that the governor makes there, and I want to ask you about each of them. First off, the idea that this would require the registry to issue licenses without verifying people's identity. My understanding is the proponents say the exact opposite thing, that essentially they say you can be an undocumented immigrant and have copious material that proves you are who you say you are and that you live where you say you live. Does the governor have a point here, or is he misrepresenting what the bill would do?
I mean, according to the Secretary of State's office and to the lawmakers and advocates behind this bill, according to them, he's misrepresenting this. The RMV has used foreign passports and consular IDs in the past to verify the identity of green card holders, asylum seekers, DACA recipients, and other people who do have permission to be in the country and legal immigration status. But those passports and other documents don't change just because you're here without legal permission. And so it's kind of confusing to hear that the RMV can't verify someone's identity using those documents if it's already happening. As far as the voting concerns, that's also kind of odd, considering the governor did not parrot those concerns when Trump was making them during the 2020 presidential election and afterward. And yet it's coming up now. My understanding from Galvin's office is that even with automated voter registration, there are some checks in place to prevent someone who is not authorized to vote from getting registered. So there was another part of Baker's opposition here that comes down to the platform on immigration. And that to me makes more sense coming from him. He remains concerned about giving driving privileges to Massachusetts residents who don't have legal status. He did not say this verbatim, but other opponents have described it as sort of validating or legitimizing the presence of undocumented immigrants. And so I think this really does, when you look at the nuts and bolts, come down to people's views on illegal immigration.
Matt, as the legislature moves toward their end of session deadline, what other issues should people be keeping an eye on that are likely to take center stage, whatever they get done or don't get done?
Yeah, well, I think we should see over the next few months some type of bill changing our elections in the state, sort of making permanent voting by mail, which currently we cannot do, even though we were allowed to do it in 2020 and parts of 2021. I think the big question there is whether the state or at least legislature agrees to allow same-day registration. So you could have this sort of major change to how people vote or how they register. Another sort of contentious thing that's been floating around Beacon Hill for years is legalizing sports betting in Massachusetts, where both the Senate and the House now have passed bills, but sort of this hang up of, well, how much do you, what type of sports do you allow that, betting to be on, particularly college sports, right, which the Senate doesn't want to. So can they find a middle ground of allowing college sports betting, but not on colleges within Massachusetts, but outside of it? I mean, there seems to be some ground there to meet, and something that, maybe in the grand scheme of things is not, the most important policy in the world, but is obviously one that has eaten up a lot of oxygen on Beacon Hill this year, and really for the last couple of years since the Supreme Court sort of,
told states
legalize it. Told states that they can legalize it. Yeah.
Stuff, Sleece, you get the last word here. Is there anything else you're going to be watching as the legislature gets closer to this deadline?
Yeah, if there is something sports betting related, whether there's a college sports aspect, because that is definitely that's the big crux of the conflict here. Also, the Holyoke Soldiers Home bill has still not moved forward. I think it's still in conference committee, and it's been 2 years since that COVID wave that killed 76 veterans. So I know a lot of people are waiting on that. And then lastly, behavioral health is probably one of the priorities that business leaders, mental health advocates, and others want to see passed before Governor Baker leaves office. And there appears to be consensus on that.
They got a lot of work to do. Steph Sleece of Axios Boston, Matt Stout of the Boston Globe, thank you both for talking this through. Interviews are now underway in the search for a new superintendent of the Boston Public Schools. The fifth one in 7 years, with Brenda Casellia set to step down when the school year ends in just a few weeks. Just like the last four, the new superintendent will face an uphill battle, taking over what the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education described in a report out last week as a system plagued by entrenched dysfunction. The department, also known as DESI, detailed how, quote, the district has failed to effectively serve its most vulnerable students, carry out basic operational functions, and address systemic barriers to providing an equitable, quality education. That scathing review seems to point to the possibility of a state takeover of the system, a plan that's gotten a lot of pushback from Mayor Michelle Wu and the City Council. Joining me to dig into all the problems BPS is facing and how local leaders plan to solve them is GBH education reporter Meg Woolhouse. Meg, good to see you and thank you for being here. You just did a really compelling and troubling story for GBH News on bullying problems in the Boston Public Schools. And I want to start with your piece because it gets into some really important issues that are at play when we talk about jurisdiction. What did you discover in the course of reporting your piece on bullying in BPS?
Well, it was really interesting because I had expected that some of the bullying numbers might have gone up as kids have come back to school post-pandemic or, at least returned to school. And many are acting out. But what was surprising was that we saw a big jump in the number of bullying complaints, up 80% since the last fully in-person school year. That was 2018, 2019. So that was surprising. And then when I started asking around, asking parents what was going on and asking kids about bullying, I got this overwhelming response. I actually got so many responses from parents, I couldn't interview all of them about it. One parent at the Manning School in Jamaica Plains said that the result of her bullying complaints came in the form of two separate reports from the school and the district, one substantiating the claim of bullying and one not. And I only bring this up because I think that this is an issue where the district needs to be doing a better job fixing these problems, as opposed to sowing a lot of confusion. And that was also something that the state pointed out in its audit of the district that came out last week. It was a very busy week in education.
Yeah.
And the state came out with that blistering report that you mentioned.
I felt like you were doing 2 stories a day last week. That's how it seemed. Go ahead, I spoke over
it was lively. But the state's report actually addressed bullying. Much to my surprise, we had already started writing about it and looking into it, and citing that as part of the problem.
Let's hold that thought. Sorry, just hold the thought for 1 second. Before we get to the state report, I want to ask you a little bit more about your coverage of bullying. You mentioned this sort of Kafkaesque situation in which a family's complaint resulted in both confirmation and rejection of their claim. So the district wasn't on the same page with itself there. Did the other parents and kids you talked to feel like their claims involving bullying were being taken seriously?
No, they didn't. I think that I talked with parents in East Boston. I talked with parents from Mission Hill. I talked with parents at the Manning School, and they all described sort of hitting a wall where their complaints weren't being addressed sufficiently. And some actually confirmed what the state report said, which was that they didn't feel like everybody was necessarily prepared. Everyone in the schools, the staff was necessarily prepared to handle what was going on.
That's so strange to me because we just saw the Boston Public Schools close down the Mission Hill K-8 school because of some horrific tales involving student abuse of other students. And I would have thought that everyone in the district would be on red alert, would be told by Brenda Cassellius or someone else, maybe Mayor Wu, we need to show that we're taking this stuff incredibly seriously between now and the start of the next school year. And it sounds like you found the opposite. Let's talk about some of the other problems that the state highlighted. As you note, they got into bullying, which you have just been describing for us here. What are the other big problems that the state is pointing to and suggesting that the status quo just is not working?
Well, the receivership report was pretty devastating. And I think, it was extremely blunt about how the most vulnerable students in the district aren't being served, as you pointed out. So it was talking about how special education programs weren't effective and how many special ed students are put in what's known as sub-separate settings, where they're not getting the services and the attention that they need or deserve under the law, frankly. But also it pointed to the chaos in the English language learners office. That office is just churned through numerous directors. And they're not, those students aren't showing progress. And these also happen to be, neediest students, maybe from some of the most impoverished families that aren't showing the improvements that the state would like to see. Also pointing out that the district spends a considerable amount of funding per student, that money isn't necessarily the issue here.
They also spend a lot of money on transportation, but tell me if I've got this right. The report also pointed out that there are still bus routes that are not being staffed by drivers, correct?
Yeah, and that was one of the more interesting takeaways. It was right at the top of the report because the state noted that the district has misreported that data over and over again in a way that seems actually disingenuous, reporting that leaving out of the data, the numbers of bus routes that just weren't covered by any driver.
Yeah, it seems
I'm
like...
not even sure if kids were just simply left hanging, waiting on a corner.
That seems like an
incredibly, that never came.
Yeah, incredibly important data point to try to capture, an experience to try to capture. So now we've got this strange, at least to my eye, back and forth going on between the state and the city, where you have the city pushing back against the idea of full receivership, pushing back even against the idea of something that stops short of full receivership, but basically would make Jeff Reilly, DESI's commissioner, Michelle Wu's boss when it comes to BPS management. The Boston Globe published details of, I believe, his initial proposal or DESI's initial proposal to the city, which essentially, as they described it, would say, all right, Mayor Wu, you're going to be the person who's accountable for getting all these things fixed, and you need to do it quickly, and you'll report directly to Commissioner Reilly. Mayor Wu doesn't want to do that. They've issued a counter proposal. Again, details are being leaked to the media. Where do you see this all ending ultimately?
It's a lot of back and forth, isn't it? It's surprising, especially because if you were sitting at the board meeting, the 5-hour board meeting for the Board of Education, there's a lot of pressure on Reilly to just say enough is enough and put the district into receivership. But I can feel you asking me for a guess on this, because this is the question on everyone's mind, right? Is the district going to go in receivership or not?
Yeah.
I will hazard a guess that it won't, because I don't think that the state would be engaging in this dance if it didn't, with the city, if it didn't hold out the possibility that they could reach some sort of a consensus and give Wu a chance.
That makes a lot of sense as far as informed guesses go. It also occurred to me while we were talking through the way this is playing out, it's interesting to imagine what might have been different if it had been the state pushing Governor Baker's buddy, former Mayor Marty Walsh, to yield control of the school system. And there's no way to know, but it's an interesting thought experiment. Would the tone have been the same? Would the demands have been the same? Again, we will never know. One thing I really would love you to make clear for me and anyone watching, what, if anything, has Mayor Wu done at this point in her tenure, which is still, she's still in the very early stages of being mayor. But besides coming to an agreement with Brenda Cassellius to have Cassellius leave and to bring in someone new as superintendent, what other big changes should the mayor get credit for making so far?
Well, can I just go back to what you said? Because I think
Absolutely.
that's a fantastic point. Would Baker be pursuing this with such gusto if, it's all women in charge of the schools right now? Michelle Wu in office just about 6 months. I'm not sure exactly, but Brenda Cassellius, the school chairwoman Mrs. Robinson, you know, a Black woman leading the school committee. I don't know the answer to that, but I have heard critics and activists bring that up as a factor that they're concerned about, this sort of trying to strong arm these women. That said, I don't think that they're going to bend lightly
Yeah, it doesn't
to
seem
the state, and they haven't in all of this. But I do think Wu has responded with some changes already. She introduced her new Green Deal for the schools, and I'm sure that was welcomed by many, many parents, especially this big dollar figure of $2 billion used to rebuild and reimagine the schools, which are in desperate need of repairs and upgrades. There's like a dozen schools that are about 100 years old in Boston. And it's not that that's bad, it's just that they need to be updated. The pandemic really made that clear. That said, where that $2 billion will come from, I don't know. You know, the details are a little shy right there.
We have only about a minute to wrap up, so I want to mention that one of the arguments that critics of the receivership possibility make is that they say, if you look at a place like Lawrence, for example, and the impact of receivership there, receivership isn't a magic bullet that's going to fix everything. So that's one thing that we should put out there. I want to note that this is all playing out at the same time that we have Boston heading toward a return to some kind of elected school committee, something voters backed last year when they also elected Mayor Wu. And I want to close by asking, you've got about half a minute to answer this. How do the parents and students you speak with feel about the possibility of state receivership?
The parents that I saw at the meeting, they don't like it. They feel like it's high-handed. They feel like it's racist. They feel like the state hasn't exhibited successes in its past efforts at receivership. And they note that receivership doesn't mean that the state is going to come in and tweak around the edges. They're going to put a private organization in charge of running the schools, causing yet more turmoil.
All right, Meg Woolhouse, thank you for helping me understand more than I did before what's going on with this incredibly complex situation. That is going to do it for tonight, but do come back next week. We'll size up where things stand for both the Republicans and the Democrats in the state's biggest races now that their conventions are in the rearview mirror. And as always, please tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. Or you can find me on Twitter. I'm @ReillyAdam. For now, thanks as always for watching, and good night.